Video games have a unique way of engaging players in their stories. The interactive element of video games escalates the player from an observer to a participant, inviting players to live in virtual worlds, feel the escalation of tension and drama as they themselves conquer overwhelming odds, and empathize with characters in ways never thought possible. That said, why are fighting game stories so bad? It is no surprise to anyone now or ever that fighting games just do not do stories very good. Which is odd because fighting games also give us some of the most iconic characters in video game history, but we never experience their stories in any satisfying way. And yet fighting games continue to make efforts to build deep narratives and complex stories for their characters and worlds, no matter how clumsily they do it. To be clear, I want to stress that fighting games are bad at telling stories. The plot or the canon of the story themselves isn't as important, although they also tend to be bad. Nowadays, most fighting games attempt a cinematic style of story mode, popularized by the success of NetherRealm Studios fighting games, which are typically cited as a source of praise and the best story modes in modern fighting games. But in truth, I don't feel like this method is a good way for fighting games to tell their stories. It has many limitations and structural flaws, yes, but the real reason those story modes aren't good is because they're just pretending to be movies. These story modes don't use the mechanics of fighting games in a compelling way. The fights are just filler, and the events of the fight itself doesn't matter because the outcome of the fight is predetermined by the following cutscene. You might be able to remember the events of the movies that happen in a story mode like this, but I bet you can't think of a memorable fight. And if the fighting is the least memorable part of a fighting game story mode, then I think something must be wrong. And now it's time for some statistics. As of May 2020, Mortal Kombat 11 has sold 11.6 million copies across PS4, Xbox One, and Steam, easily making it the best-selling fighting game of 2019. Of the people who purchased Mortal Kombat 11, how many of them actually played through the entirety of Story Mode? By tracking the achievements on each platform, we can see that it's 31% of players on PS4, 31% of players on Xbox, and 46% of players on Steam. If we leverage those percentages against a platform's respective player bases, we come up with these numbers. 2.2 million players on PS4, 1 million players on Xbox, and 460,000 players on Steam. A grand total of 3.8 million players out of 11.6 million players who bought Mortal Kombat 11 and completed Story Mode. That's only 32%! How does one of the world's best fighting games, with the highest AAA budget and a marketing campaign that heavily features its critically acclaimed story mode, only get 1/3 of its players to actually beat the story? Maybe it's because of a new tradition where early adopters just deadass upload the entire story mode onto YouTube, but think about that. The fights in a story mode like Mortal Kombat 11 are so unimportant that you can just remove them and watch the whole thing on YouTube, which is probably what those other 68% of players did. And if that's really the case, then I don't think this method of story mode is working. So how do we get people to play story mode? You know, other than holding characters hostage behind a story mode clear. Does the writing need to get better? Well, yes, but perhaps story mode itself is the problem. For a genre that keeps insisting on wanting a story, fighting games face a lot of unique challenges. For one, fighting games have a lot of characters, and it can be difficult to give every single one a spot in the story. This is why most fighting games are about tournaments. It's the easiest framing device for getting a bunch of weirdos from around the world to fight each other. But if every character is equally important and capable of becoming the protagonist, then it can be difficult to centralize the plot and put together a cohesive storyline. It used to be that you had to wait until the next installment of a fighting game just to figure out how the previous one ended, and that's just not good design. The NetherRealm cinematic style tries to fix this by spotlighting characters per chapter, but this isn't a sure-all fix. This ends up creating stables where you have designated heroes, designated villains, and whoever doesn't fall into either camp is either a jobber or is just absent. If you were looking forward to playing as Aaron Black, Scarlet, Captain Cold, or Atrocitus, well, get fucked. Tekken 7 has it far worse, as its story mode cuts out like 70% of the game's cast. Does it create a more focused story? Technically yes, but you can't just pretend that these characters don't exist. The worst of these is actually Guilty Gear Xrd, because they don't even try to blend fighting gameplay and storytelling, they just remove the fights altogether. There's only so far you can go when you just pretend to be a movie. There's another problem that fighting games face, and that's because modern fighting games are competitive games first, long before they are narrative games. Things that happen in-game can't have any lasting impact on the roster, which is why it never feels like fighting game stories ever stick. There's no sense of permanence or dramatic change because the standard mode of play, versus mode, needs to maintain a status quo. If a character dies in story mode, you never really feel that sense of loss that you feel if a character dies in any other genre, because you know that character has to be selectable for versus mode. For example, in BlazBlue Calamity Trigger, New dies at the end of the story. She is effectively gone from the game. But this would be bad for new players if she weren't in the next game, because she's dead. So in the sequel Continuum Shift, they introduced Lambda 11, who is literally a palette swap of New with her exact same moveset, so new players don't have to drop their main and the status quo stays intact. And yes, it is as cheap as it sounds. So because nothing in the story has permanence, the story becomes a separate entity from the rest of the game, and we just end up in the trap of just watching story modes on YouTube instead of experiencing them for ourselves because they don't offer anything unique to the player. Now, I say that this is specific to modern fighting games because the opposite used to happen in older fighting games, and I don't think it worked out either. In Killer Instinct 1, there are specific character matches that happen in the story, and in those matches, the losers canonically die. So if you played Cinder in KI1 and were looking forward to Cinder in KI2, get fucked. There is absolutely nothing more disappointing than the feeling of seeing the next installment of your favorite fighting game come out, and your favorite character didn't make the roster. And no amount of story will ever excuse that. Remember when Jin Kazama completely changes fighting styles between Tekken 3 and 4? The story reason is that he basically unlearned the Mishima style to pursue his own style of karate in order to defy his heritage. Which is cool, but it sucks for anyone who liked Jin's old moveset. So you can see that some older fighting games did try to make dramatic changes between installments, but it doesn't always work out for the long-term competitive aspect. So the problem with story modes is that by pretending to be a movie, the gameplay becomes inconsequential. The story is hard to focus on an ensemble of characters, and the story can't make any dramatic changes to the game in order to maintain a competitive status quo. Does this mean it's impossible to tell stories within a fighting game? Not at all. In fact, fighting games are excellent at telling stories and have been for a long time. It's just that no one noticed it because it doesn't happen in a mode called story mode. It happens right in versus mode. You might be confused because versus mode matches are typically non-canon, but a match doesn't have to be canon for it to have a story. Each match in VS mode has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and within that span of time, a story is being told. This is what I like to call self-contained narrative. Stories in which the canon is dictated solely by what happens in the game. The strength of fighting games is its memorable characters, and the best part of fighting games is seeing these characters interact, which happens in small self-contained encounters every time you play versus mode. If Ryu and Akuma face off in a stormy field, that's a story. But so is Guile and Zangief bumping into each other on the streets of Brazil and just duking it out. No matter what the matchup is, it's the events of the fight that create the narrative. Like any good fight scene, you watch as two fighters fight to get the upper hand on the other, capitalizing on mistakes and reacting to one another. Think about your favorite fight in an anime, and see how it could easily be reimagined as a fighting game. There are fights that come down to the wire, or fights where one player makes an amazing comeback against all odds. And if a fight is a total curb stomp, then that's also a story. The mechanics of a fighting game also help push the narrative as well. Life bars show you what's at stake for each fighter as each blow brings them closer and closer to losing the battle. Like a fight where one fighter starts getting bloodied and you can sense that they're on their last legs. Think about the drama that's implied by a super meter. It's a visual and mechanical sign that one fighter is about to attempt a big play to turn the fight in their favor. The super meter is a narrative tool that creates tension, and exciting things happen during the fight when it gets spent, whether or not the super actually hits. Now hold on, you may think. What about the canon established by characters' lore? You can't just say that Heihachi Mishima lost a fight to Lucky Chloe because it happened in a versus mode. Well, that's half true, and yes I can. You do have to take a character's canon lore into account, but only as a means of setting the stage for the fight. The events of the fight still take precedence in storytelling by showing you what exactly happens in this matchup. If you have a team of Videl, Krillin, and Yamcha, and they're fighting a team of Frieza, Cell, and Broly, then yes, canonically you have to accept that Team Videl is horrifically outclassed here. But if Team Videl actually wins, you also have to accept that you just saw how it happened, and maybe Frieza should have been blocking Videl's mix-ups. This doesn't mean that Videl is now stronger than Frieza canonically, it just means that in this particular fight, Team Videl came out victorious. Bonus points if the character actually says something like, "Holy crap, I just beat Frieza!" That's what I mean when I say self-contained narrative, because the story being told by the fight illustrated an unlikely win against overwhelmingly powerful foes. Unfortunately, the nature of Dragon Ball's narrative style makes this an impossibility because all character strength is outlined by relative power levels as a hard, immutable metric, so things like skill, technique, or tactics don't matter, and Videl would realistically never be able to hurt Frieza no matter how good her mix-up game is. And this is why I don't like Dragon Ball. Thankfully, there now exists a character that lets me demonstrate self-contained narrative in the most fantastic way I've ever seen. Let's talk about Lowain. For those unfamiliar with Grand Blue Fantasy, it's set in a sky world of airships and floating island continents. Between all these sky-faring adventurers, esteemed knight captains, wielders of ancient relics, and primordial powers from beyond the heavens, Lowain is just a cook. He is, by and large, the game's joke character, and canonically speaking, he shouldn't have an Ice Cube's chance in hell of defeating any other cast member in a proper fight. But check out what happens when Lowain does win.
ローアイン選手、激闘の末、ついに勝利をもぎ取りました。デュエル界に衝撃っていう？
まあそういう人生一発逆転的な要素を考えるよね。
真面目にコツコツが大事なんだぞ、ローアイン君。
お前、真面目かよ。
でもわかりみ。
If Lowain wins a fight, it's because it was all just a bogus story he made up while chilling with the bros. Even if the player demonstrates amazing skill and makes Lowain look like a champ in battle, it's all just an embellishment of Lowain's imagination. So if Lowain wins against Zoe, the primal beast of world balance, then he was just talking it up in a bar. And if Lowain loses, then yeah, of course he did. Canonically speaking, Lowain never wins a fight, and that's amazing. One of my favorite things that fighting games do is acknowledge when certain matchups frame a specific narrative. Something as simple as Ryu and Ken's fist bump recontextualizes what's normally a street brawl as a fight between friendly rivals. This happens all the time in Arc Systems games when characters will load a unique voice set and sometimes unique music when matched against a character related to them.
もう我慢できないの。がっついてんじゃねえよ、すっご野郎。まずは楽しもうぜ。
Check out how this works in Soul Calibur 6. Keelik and Xianghua are best friends, and when they fight, it's framed as the two having a friendly sparring match. But in this game, Keelik's soul charge puts him in this ultra-violent state where he struggles to contain the corruption of the evil seed. In any other matchup, Keelik entering the state can be seen as simply succumbing to the dark power. But watch what happens when you use this ability against Xianghua during their sparring match. With this change in voice line, Kilik can still unleash his dark mode against Xianghua, but without breaking the canon that she's his best friend and that he cares about her. Another way that fighting games acknowledge the canon of their characters is through animation. Characters like Slayer, Rachel Alucard, and Persona's Elizabeth are implied to be so inhumanly powerful that victory against them is canonically impossible. But since this is a fighting game, you have to be able to KO them. Check out what happens when Slayer loses. Even though the fight illustrates how Slayer lost the battle, canonically he wasn't so much defeated as much as he simply decided not to win. To characters like Slayer and Elizabeth, being defeated is almost an amusement. Rachel takes this to an even more insane degree. It's not just when she's defeated that she shows how uninvested she is in the fight, it's every time she gets hit. Or to be more accurate, every time she doesn't. If you look closely at Rachel's hit animations, Rachel never suffers from a single hit in battle because Nago and Guy are taking the damage in her stead. In a way, Rachel losing is simply Rachel deciding to stop fighting out of boredom in order to frame the narrative of the battle. Although I understand that it might be unreasonable to just delete story mode, storytelling through versus mode is great and all, but I also know that it flies over most people's heads. Funny thing is, some fighting games have managed to solve the problems of story mode on a few rare occasions, whether by pure accident or inspired intention. So I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight these exceptional moments in fighting game stories and explain what makes them work. I mentioned before that fighting games require a status quo to be maintained in order to keep the game balanced for regular VS play. But the one advantage of keeping story mode as a separate mode is that you can break the balance of the game in order to create drama or tension for a player. Any fighting game with a non-playable boss already does this by giving you a boss of absolutely epic scale, or a boss that's infuriatingly overpowered. But some games can even go the opposite direction. During a chapter of BlazBlue Continuum Shift, Jin becomes unable to use his sword Yuki Anisa for plot reasons. In the subsequent fight, you play as Jin versus Unlimited Tsubaki. Not only is Tsubaki super buffed for this fight, but Jin can't use any of his C attacks, drive attacks, or special moves. You only have your punches and kicks, which doesn't even get you a full combo. Jin is crippled in this fight, both plot-wise and game-wise, and you actually experience how weak and helpless Jin is without his sword. It would also be disingenuous not to mention Tekken 7 story mode, specifically the final battle between Heihachi and Kazuya. Despite the many drawbacks of Tekken 7's story, I think this final battle is the single best story moment I've ever experienced in a fighting game. Every round of this fight just builds more and more tension and drama, using every cinematic trick that the game has used until this point, like cutting to these flashback moments during hard knockdowns in which the player can't act anyway. The real special moment of this fight is Heihachi's final stand, which breaks both the game's rules to convey its story, as well as cleverly utilizes one of the game's cinematic features that's already built in. During this final battle, Heihachi is down to a middling 15% of his health. Narratively, Heihachi is on his last legs. Devil Kazuya, who is already an overpowered version of regular Kazuya, has infinite rage and can use his rave drive as many times as he wants. But Heihachi, refusing to give in, only takes minimal damage from all of Kazuya's attacks. Not only that, but because Heihachi is at 15% health, this causes the game's dramatic slow motion mechanic to trigger every time Heihachi and Kazuya are about to trade blows, making each hit feel like it could be the last. And yet Heihachi refuses to die. This is literally too angry to die as a gameplay experience, and it's amazing. There is one last sample I'd like to highlight, and you'd be surprised to know that it's the Shao Kahn fight from Mortal Kombat 9. I'm aware that I've been spending most of this video pointing out the faults and flaws of NetherRealm story modes, and I've been hugely critical of Mortal Kombat in general, but this fight in Mortal Kombat 9 demonstrates how you can use something as simple as matchups to establish characters' relative power. When you fight Shao Kahn for the first time, you fight him as Liu Kang. Against Kahn's moveset, Liu Kang actually has very few tools to properly counteract him. It's difficult to approach Khan because of his shoulder tackles that knock you back and because of his projectiles. And even if you use your flying kick to approach, he sometimes just armors through it and opens you up to get knocked back again. At best, the only thing you can do is use low fireballs against his javelin throw, but that turns the fight into a series of carefully aimed pot shots, and you still feel trapped against Khan's overwhelming advantages. In other words, Liu Kang versus Shao Kahn is a bad matchup, and the game uses this matchup to make Khan feel more overpowering and intimidating. The second time you fight Shao Kahn, you are playing as Raiden. Plot-wise, Raiden receives a power-up from the Elder Gods that allows him to fight Shao Kahn at equal power, but this is a lie. Not only is Shao Kahn unchanged since the last time you fought him as Liu Kang, but Raiden hasn't changed either. He's still the same Raiden you've been playing all chapter and the same Raiden you play in VS mode, but Raiden has one tool that Liu Kang doesn't: a teleport. Raiden can do full combos on Shao Kahn while he's still winding up his slow moves just by teleporting behind him. So by changing absolutely nothing but giving you a better matchup, the player feels empowered and Shao Kahn feels weaker. I can't tell for sure if this aspect of power scaling via matchup was intentional or if it was just a brilliant accident, but seeing how they fucked up in MKX by doing the exact opposite, I'm willing to believe the latter. Part of me wishes more fighting games would just stop obsessing over fancy story cinematics, but I know that's not likely to happen because story mode cutscenes are pretty and make for good trailer material. But I do think fighting games have the potential to actually have engaging and memorable stories, whether or not it happens in self-contained matches. Stories and fighting don't have to be separate, because a fight is a story. That's it for today's A.B.I.torial. Hopefully next time you play a fighting game you can see the narrative that happens during the fight. If you don't mind me making the rounds, allow me to remind you to give this video a like and leave a comment below on what you think about fighting game story modes. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more anime and game content from Sugar Punch. Our channel is made possible by our wonderful patrons here, and you can help support us too by checking out our Patreon to get early access to future videos. I'm A.B.I., and I'll see you all later.